Okay.
You're all set, Tom.
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
I'm going to read this lovely quote from Branch Rickey in case you can't read it, and it's fun to read anyway. In a profession where the physical is dominant in the triune nature of man, it would be surprising indeed if we did not find here and there an occasional scalawag. As Branch Rickey knew from his own experience, there aren't many saints in baseball. But when he used the word scallywag, he was talking about rough characters, professional ball players who drank, swore, fought, not serious criminals. The transgressions that we see in modern professional baseball, they tend to stem from vice and character flaws, things like drunk driving, sexual misbehavior, on and off the field cheating. We don't get a lot of organized or stranger on stranger crimes, things like murder, extortion, major theft, arson. And the most obvious reason for this is that at least at the upper competitive levels, today's professional baseball players live in a social bubble, well paid, protected, kept apart from what the rest of us consider to be real life, and at the same time, constantly paid attention to. But things were very different in baseball's amateur era. Most baseball players of that time lived entirely in the real world. And the real world has a dark side, which of course includes crime. So I'm going to tell you a few stories involving prominent amateur baseball men to illustrate this. Next slide. There aren't a lot of pictures of Joseph Leggett. I found this one in a history of the 13th New York State Militia that he served in. That's him on the right seated, the lanky guy with the beard. I don't know, you might recognize another member of the Excelsior Baseball Club on the left, John B. Woodward, who actually ran for mayor in the 1880s. This unit served in the Civil War. Leggett did 2 tours of duty. And was a serial embezzler. Financial crimes were surprisingly common among amateur or ball players, even on clubs at the upper end of the respectability spectrum, like the Knickerbockers and the Excelsiors. And, you know, I've thought a lot about this over the years and trying to figure out why. And one of the reasons for this is kind of obvious. A lot of them worked in financial services. There were a lot of bankers, insurance men, and stockbrokers in these clubs. And the other is that what we consider general accounting principles and normal government regulation were weak or non-existent in pre-Civil War America. And operating without clear guidelines, many 19th century money men succumbed to the temptation to commingle, borrow, and misuse clients' funds. And the line between sloppiness and fraud could be very hard to discern. And then we have Leggett, the star catcher of the pre-war Brooklyn Excelsiors. And I'm probably not the only person in this group who does this, but it's a fun thing to imagine if you got into a time machine and went back to watch a game in 1860, say, you know, what would jump out at you as being the oddest or most surprising thing? And for me, it's watching the catcher. Because, you know, we might know that they didn't have gloves or equipment. There's no backstop. But imagine what it looked like to see a guy scrambling to stop pitching when there's nobody on base and there aren't 2 strikes set up maybe 30 feet behind the plate. There's a reason why so many clubs of the late 1850s and into the 1860s had their best athlete at catcher, guys that in a few years will be playing shortstop like George Wright, because it took an incredible amount of agility and ability and even physical courage to catch. It's almost something that's hard for us to imagine. No face mask, no gloves, no shin guards. The only thing stopping the ball from skipping away from the field and letting runners circle the bases is the catcher's body. Game accounts of the 1850s rarely tell of a pitcher being taken out of a game, but catchers were often removed with broken noses and fractured fingers. When there were 2 strikes on the batter, a particularly aggressive catcher would move up behind the batter, spread out his bare hands, risking his face to catch a foul tip. This is something that Henry Chadwick liked to call taking balls sharp off the bat, a la Joe Leggett. And this is not picture of Joe Leggett, but it gives you an idea of what it would have looked like when he came up behind the batter with 2 strikes to try and grab a foul tip. Well, let's talk about Leggett. He moved to Brooklyn from upstate New York as a young man, where his family had a wholesale grocery business in Lower Manhattan. And if you know your amateur era baseball, you won't be surprised that he served as a volunteer fireman. In Leggett's case, with the Pacific Engine Company 14 in Brooklyn Heights. Leggett, his cousin James, and another cousin Isaac all served as foremen of Pacific Engine number 14. In 1861, when the Excelsiors were inactive because of the war, 2 of Leggett's teammates, Harry Polhemus and George Flanley, played for the Pacific 14 baseball team. In 1867, when he was about 40, Leggett married a 20-year-old woman named Alice Marks and soon had 3 children. Leggett had joined the Excelsiors in 1857 and was their best player until the arrival of Creighton 3 years later. Off the field, Leggett acted as sort of a pitching coach, trainer, and talent scout for the Excelsiors, helping to develop not only the great James Creighton, whom he taught to lift weights, but also 2 of the other great pitchers of the day, Asa Brainerd and Candy Cummings. Older than most of his teammates, Leggett was a father figure who, in modern baseball terminology, policed the Excelsiors clubhouse. He was respected throughout the sport. He was elected vice president of baseball's national governing body in 1862. And the only wart on his baseball portrait was his odd behavior in the notorious forfeit championship game between the Excelsiors and Atlantics in 1860, which is a subject for another talk. As fine a ball player and as solid a teammate as he may have been, Leggett was a deeply flawed human being. During and after his playing career, Leggett held a string of jobs in institutions connected to the powerful men behind the Excelsiors, and he was repeatedly caught with his hand in the till. In 1859, he was working at the Mercantile Library Association, a pet charity of the Brooklyn gentry, including several well-heeled members of the Excelsior Baseball Club. And he was caught trying to rig an officer's election. During the Civil War, Leggett was made quartermaster of the 13th New York State Militia. You might wonder whose brilliant idea it was to put the ethically challenged Leggett in charge of purchasing and dispensing supplies for a military unit. The answer is John Woodward, who we saw in the previous picture, a fellow member of the Excelsiors. Now, not too long ago, I ran across one of the sort of memorial volume when John Woodward died, and in it had letters that he wrote home from the Civil War, gushing about Joe Leggett being the greatest guy in the world. And he obviously had some personal charm, but while Leggett was serving as quartermaster, there was a scandal involving him selling provisions and replacing them with cheaper items for his own troops. Leggett progressed from stealing from the army to stealing from the needy. In 1869, the Brooklyn Fire Department made Leggett treasurer of the Widows and Orphans Fund. 3 years later, he failed to deposit $3,000 in proceeds from a charity ball. An official investigation found that his boss, an old friend from Pacific Engine Company number 14, had dropped the matter after Leggett reneged on a promise to pay the money back. He was forced to resign, and he was given a clerical position with the Brooklyn Police Department Excise Bureau, which was the body that issued liquor licenses in those days. It also employed a number of old ball players. In 1877, Leggett disappeared with $2,500 in license fees. And this is what the Brooklyn Union Argus said about it. Joe Leggett, runaway clerk of the Excise Bureau, is still wanted by the police. His whereabouts is a mystery. In consequence of his sudden and improvident departure, his wife was obligated a few days before New Year's to give up her house in Monroe Street, where she and her children, are now boarding with friends. Leggett's best friends are loud in their denunciation of his misconduct. Having burned his final bridge, Leggett legged it. As far as we know, he left New York never to return. Family oral history has that he died in prison in Galveston, Texas in 1894. Unfortunately, any records that might confirm this are missing for obvious reasons if you know anything about Texas history and what happened in 1900 in Galveston. There is intriguing circumstantial evidence, intriguing to me, that the fugitive Leggett may have kept in touch with his abandoned wife or his brother and his cousin, with whom she lived for a while. and people in the baseball world. There are little hints that his new name and location might have been an open secret among New York baseball men. In 1889, Henry Chadwick was writing one of those columns he liked to write, Where Are They Now? And he's writing about the great Excelsiors of 1860, and this is what he writes. Ed Russell, Asa Brainerd, and Tom Reynolds are dead and gone. Pearsall is a doctor in the South. Harry Polhemus is one of Brooklyn's society men and a millionaire. John Whiting is in business in the city. His brother Charlie also. I believe, while Joe Leggett is, well, I will be silent for old time's sake. It's interesting to me that he didn't say that he didn't know where Leggett was. Our next criminal is Charles Peverelli. You've heard his name, I'm sure, because of his book, 1866 book, American Pastimes, which is a treasure trove of information about early baseball. What's interesting is, researching him, I ran across a person with the same name who had committed an infamous crime. And there's a lot of people in his family with the name Charles Augustus, and I couldn't believe that it was the same person, because he's a conspicuous person with a public career, an important sports journalist, and for decades there's no mention of him in connection with this crime that he committed, which made national headlines. But it was the same man. He spent much of his life trying to live down a nationally publicized felony he committed in his early 30s. Remarkably, he succeeded. A few years after his 1854 conviction for arson, newspapers simply stopped mentioning it. In middle and old age, he reinvented himself as a sports writer, but his past went unmentioned. How did he do it? Well, Peverelli had two things going for him: influential friends and connections in journalism, a useful combination today. In the late 1840s, Peverelli operated LaGrange Place, which was a day resort on the Hudson River near Bulls Ferry, New Jersey. Served by Hudson River ferries, it was a day trip destination for New Yorkers. It regularly hosted outings of the Light Guard and City Guard, which were socially prestigious militia units made up largely of bankers, insurance men, commercial merchants, the same demographic as membership of many early baseball clubs and the Knickerbockers. With help from friends in the City Guard, the ambitious Peverelli quit the hospitality industry and set up in Lower Manhattan as a commission merchant. This was an important component of New York's port economy. Commission merchants were middlemen who offloaded cargo from ships for out-of-town owners, stored them, arranged for them to be auctioned, and took a percentage. Peverelli spent freely to impress his new friends, and it got him into money trouble. In 1853, he hosted a party for the City Guard at his weekend place in Ravenswood, Queens. Now known for gritty housing projects that have produced several rappers and a few NBA players like Vern Fleming and Metta World Peace, in the 1850s, Ravenswood was a fashionable summer colony where Knickerbockers catcher Charles DeBow also had a cottage. The New York Times described Peverelli's lavish affair: tents on the grounds adjoining the house, free-flowing champagne. Whatever events like this cost, apparently it was more than Peverelli could afford. One night in July of 1854, Charles Peverelli and his 14-year-old brother Theodore, who spent his entire adult life working for the New York Times, were arrested while setting fire to a warehouse on Front Street in Lower Manhattan. Investigators discovered that Peverelli had been stealing goods belonging to his own clients and other tenants of the warehouse. The purpose of the arson was to cover up the thefts. This crime touched a nerve of anti-New York feeling around the country. The Raleigh Register from North Carolina called Peverelli, quote, a fair specimen of the rottenness and prodigality of New York society. The New York Light Guard wrote to the Evening Post to deny that Peverelli belonged to it. Another newspaper editorialized, Peverelli was considered of high standing among merchants, generally much respected, but he was a fast young man who kept fine horses and lived in style, and though doing a good business, was not content to keep within his means, and hence his ruin. The Virginia's Richmond Examiner wrote an interesting piece about Peverelli, predicting that, as with other well-connected New York businessmen who had committed similar crimes, Peverelli's friends would get him off. Quote, no blame in the principal city circles of New York attaches to these estimable but unfortunate gentlemen, the leading capitalists of the North will no doubt make every effort to restore them to that sphere of financial usefulness from which they have fallen, unquote. And did that come true? The charges against Theodore Peverelli were dropped because he was a minor. Charles Peverelli was convicted and sentenced to 4.5 years in Sing Sing under a tough new law inspired by a series of devastating fires in New York City that set long minimum sentences for arson or attempted arson of any building that adjoined an inhabited residential building. Represented by two expensive and politically well-connected lawyers, Peverelli appealed, and his conviction was overturned on a pair of amusing technicalities, one being that the charges used the incorrect street address for the warehouse, and the other papers out of order here. The other, that the warehouse did not adjoin the neighboring residential buildings because, although inches away, it didn't physically touch them. The DA did not retry the case. At which point, Peverelli launched a new career covering baseball for the New York Daily News. By the mid-1860s, he was writing for 3 New York papers. In 1866, he included a long chapter on baseball in his Book of American Pastimes, the book for which he is remembered today, but in later years wrote mostly on yachting and rowing, in which he competed as a founding member of the Atalanta Boating Club, Manhattan. In 1897, Charles and Mary Peverelli threw a lavish party to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle covered the event, noting that before his career as a sports writer, Peverelli had been, quote, a well-known commercial merchant, unquote. Okay. Treason, you don't get that too often today in Major League Baseball. Some 90 members of the Brooklyn Excelsior served in the Civil War in the Union Army. Star first baseman and physician Andrew T. Pearsall fought on the other side, and it's not entirely clear why. Also known as AT or Alec, Pearsall told 2 different stories of how, why, and when he ended up in a Confederate uniform. Which one was true? Well, in my opinion, neither. And as any genealogist can tell you, the lies people tell reveal a lot more than the truth. The first story comes from an 1899 memoir by Major John Austin, who served with Pearsall in the 9th Kentucky Confederate Cavalry. Austin writes, Dr. A.T. Pearsall, who was made surgeon of the regiment, was in Europe completing his medical studies when the war commenced, and while the guns of Beauregard were thundering at the walls of Sumter, he was on his way across the Atlantic to offer his services to the bleeding South, the land of his nativity. You'll probably recognize a little bit of the lost cause ideology that came into vogue in the 1890s there. Soft pedaling what Nikki Haley now knows the war was about and emphasizing regional loyalty. This is kind of humorous in light of what I'm about to tell you about Pearsall. The second version of his story appears in his obituary in the Tioga County Record, Pearsall's hometown paper. It reads, Tioga County in upstate New York, I'll add. It reads, he was graduated in October 1861 from Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons. He at once went south and entered the Confederate Army as a surgeon. The information behind both of these stories undoubtedly came from Pearsall himself, the first reflecting what he had told fellow soldiers during the war, and the second what he told friends and family in Owego, New York, near Binghamton, where he lived the last 25 years of his life. It is true that Pearsall graduated in the fall of 1861 from medical school, the College of Physicians and Surgeons that's now part of Columbia. It's not true that he immediately joined the Confederate Army, and he was never in medical school in Europe and was not abroad when the war started. Pearsall was living in Brooklyn when the war started, and he remained there for a good 1.5 years. He left New York sometime between July 28th and October 6th, 1862. When compared to the truth, A.T. Pearsall's version of events don't tell us why he went over to the Confederacy, but they do tell us that he did not want to be seen as a traitor. This is why he allowed his friends to believe that he was an actual native of the South. Pearsall was born in Florence, Alabama, because his father happened to be building a railroad bridge across the Tennessee River. Neither of his parents had any Southern roots. Both came from Shenango County, New York. The Pearsalls returned to upstate New York when A.T. was between 4 and 6. In the second half of 1862, Pearsall left Brooklyn and joined the Confederate Army. Why? Well, if you go through the newspaper headlines, something jumps out at you. On June 19th, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Territorial Abolition Act, outlawing slavery in all United States territories outside the control of a state. 3 days later, he read the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to the cabinet. From that moment onward, Lincoln was publicly committed to abolishing slavery throughout the United States. It was only a matter of how and when. In 1861, many Northerners were torn between loyalty to the Union and ideological support of slavery, which had ended only a generation or so earlier in New York State. In the 19th century, central New York and Tioga County, where Pearsall lived, were considered particularly racist. In the late 1840s, Binghamton was described as one of the most pro-slavery areas in central New York. In 1846, Owego fired its Presbyterian minister and sent him back to Massachusetts after he attempted to lead a prayer for our brethren in bonds. After mysteriously disappearing from the Excelsiors and his successful Brooklyn medical practice, Pearsall surfaces in the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. We know this because he bumped into an old friend there. The story appeared in the New York Clipper. Quote, a baseball player turned rebel. The Excelsior Baseball Club of Brooklyn recently expelled one of its members, A.T. Pearsall, for deserting the flag of the Union and going over to the rebels. He was a physician and doing a good business. During the past winter, he left, and no one knew where he had gone. Sometime since, he was heard from in Richmond, Virginia, as a brigade surgeon on the rebel General Morgan's staff. He had charge of some Union prisoners when he recognized a gentleman from Brooklyn, formerly a member of the Excelsior Club, and entered into a conversation with him. He asked about Leggett, Flanley, Creighton, and Brainerd, whom he wished particularly to be remembered to. These facts came to the knowledge of the club, and they expelled him by a unanimous vote. The events referred to in this story had to have happened between Pearsall's final appearance on a baseball field in Brooklyn in August and late October of '62, when Creighton's death made national news. Another reason to suspect that Pearsall went over to the Confederacy for political and not personal reasons is that he was not alone when he went to Richmond. He was accompanied by a group of people, one of whose names we know, and he was another ball player, Alexander Babcock of the Brooklyn Atlantics, born and raised in Princeton, New Jersey, who had never lived in the South. Babcock and Pearsall co-founded a baseball club in Richmond, a project that Henry Chadwick, whose wife Jane belonged to a prominent Virginia family, had been pushing when the war broke out. Later in the war, Pearsall went to Atlanta, where he treated wounded soldiers. In 1868, he married a nurse named Mary Graves, settled in her hometown near Montgomery, Alabama, and opened a medical practice. According to an 1869 story in the Clipper, however, he continued to play baseball. Quote, another old player, and one whose play at first base was hard to surpass even in those days, was Alec Pearsall of the Excelsior Club, now of the Montgomery Club of Alabama. The doctor was a splendid baseman. The way he held the ball at first was a mystery to his opponents, unquote. Pearsall's club, the Pelhams, was one of Alabama's earliest. In 1878, Pearsall was divorced, and he moved back to upstate New York, where he lived the life of a small-town GP. His neighbors seem not to have known that he had been one of the stars of the legendary pre-war Excelsiors. In the 1880s and 90s, the Tioga Record social column tells us that Pearsall made repeated trips to New York City, but does not say whom he was visiting. If he met up with any old Excelsior teammates, none of them reported it. Nor did Henry Chadwick, who liked to include sightings of old-time ball players in his Daily Eagle column. You can imagine explanations for this. Maybe that Pearsall would not have been welcome. The hard feelings from the Civil War had a long life, and Pearsall had been drummed out of the club as a traitor. It may be that some of his old teammates met Pearsall and kept quiet about it. Well, there's an intriguing item in the 1880 Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons alumni directory that lists Pearsall as holding a position of consulting doctor with the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. Well, one of the directors of this railroad was Harry Polhemus, Pearsall's wealthy ex-teammate. This is Alexander Babcock, the one who accompanied Pearsall to the South. He was the brother of William Babcock, a founding member of the Atlantics, the greatest dynasty of baseball's amateur era. In the 1850s, both men worked as engravers and played for the Atlantics. Both served in the Union Army in 1861. After defecting to the South in late 62 with A.T. Pearsall, Alexander Babcock printed Confederate currency in Richmond and then joined the infamous cavalry unit Mosby's Rangers, pictured here. After the war, he stayed in Richmond and played baseball with the local club well into the 1860s. Well, Babcock's story raises more than one interesting legal issue. One being, was he guilty of treason? In 1867, former Confederate President Jefferson Davis was facing treason charges. His defense lawyers were preparing to argue that when his home state of Mississippi left the Union, he was no longer legally a citizen of the United States, which of course begs the question that was the casus belli. If the Confederacy was a legitimate independent state, a citizen of that state could not be committing treason by serving in its military. You can't be guilty of betraying someone else's country. Worried that the Davis trial might establish an awkward precedent on the legality of secession, President Andrew Johnson decided to issue a blanket pardon for the crime of treason that covered all former Confederate officers and officials, soldiers and officials. The Jefferson Davis trial never took place, but his hypothetical legal defense would not, of course, have applied to Babcock, who spent his entire life in New Jersey and New York. What about war crimes? This is a somewhat stickier question. Babcock served as an officer under John Mosby. That's him right at the lower left-hand corner of the orange box. Mosby was commander of what was called the Irregular 43rd Battalion of Virginia Cavalry. These were also called partisans. They were authorized by an 1862 Confederate law called the Partisan Ranger Act. They were in a legal and ethical gray zone as freelance marauders outside the regular command structure of the Army, in a similar way to seagoing privateers. The category included many different kinds of units, ranging from bloodthirsty quasi-terrorists like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, to the less appalling John McNeil and Colonel Mosby, who enforced his own kind of military discipline. Mosby adhered to a quirky personal code, for example, abstaining personally from looting and theft while allowing his men to do both. The problem with operating in a gray zone is the grayness. In one ugly series of events, Union cavalrymen under George Custer hanged some of Mosby's Rangers in retaliation for the alleged murder of one of their men who had surrendered. Mosby responded by executing 3 men captured from Custer's command, leaving notes around their necks saying, "These have been hung in retaliation for an equal number of Mosby's men." Robert E. Lee publicly disapproved of all partisan units on ethical grounds, although he considered Mosby's unit to be among the least objectionable. In 1864, the law was revoked, with Mosby's being one of only 2 irregular units allowed to continue. After the war, Mosby and Babcock were covered by President Johnson's pardon, and neither was ever charged with a crime. A final difficulty is that it's difficult to say what a war crime would have been in Babcock's time. The concept itself was somewhat under construction in the 1860s. Military organizations have always had ethical rules and policies, and there have always been generally accepted ideas about what's right and wrong in war, but none of them had the force of law. During the Civil War, there was no Geneva Convention or other formally agreed upon statutes to serve as the basis for a war crimes prosecution. So we're left with no doubt that Alexander Babcock betrayed his country, and the odd fact that he served in both sides in the military. On the charge of war crimes, the jury must remain out. You may not have all heard this man's name. He's not a player, or at least a top player, but you probably remember the 1973 film The Sting, in which Robert Redford and Paul Newman played con men who figure out how to intercept and delay telegraphed horse racing results. Well, this is what Alexander Samuels was arrested for doing in the 1880s. Like many amateur ball players, Samuels served in the Civil War, suffering a fractured leg. In 1865, he bought a liquor store in Brooklyn with an old army buddy, and a year later opened an oyster saloon and got the first of many tickets for serving liquor on Sunday in violation of blue laws. In 1868, he married and had 12 children. One, a son he named O'Brien Samuels, after the baseball-playing O'Brien brothers of the Atlantics. Alexander Samuels moved easily through the overlapping circles of Brooklyn politics, sports, and gambling. In 1869, Dr. Joseph B. Jones of the Excelsiors emceed a billiards tournament at Samuels' Assembly Billiard House in what is now downtown Brooklyn. The Assembly House was a hangout for bookmakers, gamblers, boxers, and the broader sporting fraternity. The Brooklyn Atlantics made it their clubhouse in 1871. Samuels frequently served as an officer of the Atlantics and filled in as president when James Buckley died in 1872. At this point, prosperous and riding high in Brooklyn society, Samuels bought an expensive English-made yacht with a 103-foot waterline. And then his luck started to go bad. The financial panic of 1873 coincided with his decision to extend himself financially to buy Brooklyn's New Park Theater. The following year, he declared bankruptcy and was sued by creditors. In 1877, he went high promoting classical music concerts, and low sponsoring pedestrienne, as they called her, Madame Anderson, in a series of walking races. Mid-19th century female pedestrianism was more or less of an excuse for men to ogle scantily dressed women. Samuels lost money on both ventures and continued to pay fines for violating blue laws. In 1883, his wife burned to death in a horrible kitchen accident, after which he began to drink heavily, and his downward social and personal descent picked up speed. He ended up in Coney Island, then a haven for bootleggers, bookmakers, mobsters, and pimps, run by the hyper-corrupt political boss John Y. McCain. At this point, Coney Island is not part of Brooklyn. It's in Kings County, but not under the control of the city. There, Samuels was arrested for wiretapping. He was described in one newspaper story as, quote, a slippery character who had once married into the upper order of Brooklyn society, unquote. In 1883, wiretapping didn't mean illegally accessing a telephone line. As I mentioned, it meant intercepting telegraph transmissions. The idea is you delay the horse racing results, the reporting of the results, to place last-minute bets on the winners. Samuel's love life is impossible to keep straight without a scorecard. In 1886, he married his children's nanny. She soon divorced him on the grounds of cruelty and infidelity. In 1889, he was named as a co-respondent in another man's divorce. In 1895, when he was 55, he abandoned either his third or fourth wife, I'm not sure, and their children. After a few more financial and personal zigs and zags, including opening a bowling alley and co-founding the Bowling Alley Owners Association, a bowling alley owners association with Charles Ebbets. Samuels died in 1913 after spending the final 8 years of his life in the New York State Soldiers and Sailors Home in Bath, New York. Most baseball histories will tell you that Harry Wright was the architect of the famous 1868-70 Cincinnati Red Stockings. After all, he was the prominent baseball man with the Eastern connections. But this isn't really true. It was club secretary John P. Joyce who spotted teenage outfielder Cal McVeigh on an Indianapolis amateur club. He was sent to Philadelphia to attempt to sign catcher John Radcliffe, a star, and when he didn't succeed, he spent, quote, a week quietly watching amateur games on fences surrounding brickyards in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and picked out and sent to Cincinnati 22-year-old Doug Allison, future star catcher. Finding a prospect like a McVeigh or an Allison takes more baseball acumen than signing an established star. John P. Joyce did not play baseball for the Red Stockings or anyone else that we know of. How did he become the club's go-to talent scout and principal executive? This is one of the many intriguing unknowns about Joyce. Some news stories about the Red Stockings management describe him as, quote, John P. Joyce of John P. Joyce and Company. But there was no such company. Born in Ireland about 1840, Joyce had sailed to America with his father as a young boy. They were Gaelic-speaking famine refugees, probably from a part of Galway and Mayo, still known as Joyce country. It's full of people named Joyce who speak Gaelic. As John Joyce later told the story, when he and his father arrived at bustling South Street in New York City, they stepped off the boat, got separated in a crowd, and never saw each other again. Young John was put in an orphanage by police who couldn't understand Gaelic. The rest of Joyce's life story, up to 1865, when he appears in Cincinnati working for a Kentucky criminal organization that sold lottery tickets, is fragmentary, but it seems that Joyce, like other big city orphans, worked as a newsboy, and newsboys often sold lottery tickets, which is probably how he met Richard France, the so-called lottery king who became his unofficial adoptive father. Lotteries and the related numbers racket were important revenue streams for 19th century organized crime. Men like Richard France would buy all the tickets in a particular lottery at a negotiated discount and then handle the public sale and drawing. They increased their profits by selling policy, a betting game based on drawn lottery ticket numbers, and by forging and selling duplicate tickets. Scandals led most states to outlaw lotteries in the pre-Civil War years. But underworld organizations imported them from Cuba and other countries and bribed legislators in Louisiana, Kentucky, and other states to keep the state lotteries going. They sold these tickets illegally throughout the country, which requires paying off local politicians and police. John Joyce worked for someone named Policy Bill Smith, who with his partner William France, a son of Richard France, operated in Cincinnati across the Ohio River, from across the Ohio River in organized crime-friendly northern Kentucky. They belonged to a pyramid of overlapping organizations owned by bookies, crooked politicians, and horse racing figures. At the top of this pyramid were Benjamin Wood, brother of New York City Mayor Fernando Wood, and John Morrissey, bookmaker, boxer, Tammany Hall Politico, congressman. Morrissey built the Saratoga, New York racing track and controlled the top baseball club, Unions of Lansingburg, also known as the Troy Haymakers. John Joyce may have played baseball at some point in his life, but it wouldn't be surprising if he had acquired his baseball expertise and connections working in a gambling operation. Bookmakers often understand sports in a more profound way than sports writers, executives, fans, and even players. With the large amounts of money they have at stake, they have to. So I'm going to tell an anecdote on this point from my life. I have a relative by marriage who was a bookmaker, and a jolly guy that I used to tease a lot, and I was too smart to ever play cards with this guy or bet anything serious with him. But for laughs, for years after we met, we would bet on the Super Bowl, like $50. So I think 12 Super Bowls in a row, he beat me. Anyone remember the 93 World Super Bowl? So it was Dallas against Buffalo, and Dallas was favored by some crazy amount. I think the betting odds I got were like 8.5 points. So I call my friend and say, we're going to do our bet this year. And he goes, yeah, but I get the Cowboys. And I said, no, I want the Cowboys. He goes, no, I'm getting the Cowboys. I go, okay, you got to give me more points then. And he said, how many do you want? And I said, 30. He said, sure. Cowboys won 52-17. Okay. Back to the story. According to sports writer Henry Miller, who traveled with the Red Stockings during their famous undefeated streak of 1868-70, it was Policy Bill Smith who came up with the idea to create the Red Stockings. Smith invested money in the club, but may have been too disreputable to actually serve as an officer. Joyce would have been well placed to represent his interests. John Joyce was a close friend and political ally of Aaron Champion. So close that Champion's political enemies tried to smear him by hinting in print that the two men were lovers. The relationship suggests that Aaron Champion may have sponsored the Red Stockings in order to further his own political ambitions, and that Joyce helped him in order to protect his illegal gambling business. Baseball historians have long struggled to understand why Joyce and Champion resigned from the Red Stockings immediately after the end of the Red Stockings' undefeated streak in some late summer of 1870. The likely answer is the urgency of their next project, which was getting Champion elected prosecuting attorney of Hamilton County, where Cincinnati is located. This even gave off a foul odor at the time. In the fall of 1870, the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune wrote this paragraph. It is understood that Mr. John P. Joyce, formerly secretary of the Red Stocking Club, is among the most active workers for Mr. Champion's election. There is a tradition, however, that Mr. Joyce was once engaged in assisting people to make fortunes through the agency of those blessed institutions which are legal in Kentucky but not in Ohio. And a rumor runs that he has the management of several policy offices in the city of Cincinnati, of which, accurately speaking, there are 42, although it would be difficult to find any policeman who would swear to the existence of one. These policy offices do business illegally, and it would not be pleasant to have a prosecutor for the county who would look too closely at them. There are those uncharitable enough to suspect that this offers some explanation for his extraordinary enthusiasm for Mr. Champion. Unquote. As it happened, Champion lost the 1870 election, not because of his associations with gambling, but because of the African-American vote. The 15th Amendment terrified Democrats across the country because newly enfranchised African-American voters were expected to vote overwhelmingly for the party of Lincoln and Grant, which of course they did. In Cincinnati, Joyce and Champion were shrewd enough to campaign for African-American votes by using African-American surrogates, but the tide was too great. Republicans swept every race in Hamilton County. As the Daily Gazette put it, quote, despite the desperate effort of corrupt rings and other disreputable parties, Champion lost by 513 votes, actually the best performance by any Democrat. Going to Plan B, John Joyce got himself appointed Secretary of the Police Commission. His first act was to request letters of resignation from the entire Cincinnati police force and put them in his drawer. In May 1866, the shocking news broke that Thomas Fitzgerald had resigned as president of the Philadelphia Athletics, the club he had co-founded. The baseball world soon found out why. Fitzgerald's city item newspaper ran stories accusing the athletics officers and players, DeWitt Clinton Moore and Hicks Hayhurst, of using, quote, hired men, officers and players, mercenaries who were paid $20 a week in violation of National Association rules on amateurism. It published a comic caricature of one of the hired men saying, quote, they generally come from New York, with one or two exceptions, and are about the hardest set we ever saw, unquote. A later story specified the athletics had 4 players who were paid, and it did not name names, but we can easily identify 2 of them, Passy Dockney from Hoboken and Lipman Pike from Brooklyn. Dockney and Pike are a good match for the hardest set we ever saw. As Fitzgerald wrote, quote, the officers of the athletic club have done much to bring the game into contempt by employing men to play in their 9 who have been repeatedly arrested and confined in the station house on charges of drunkenness and rioting. There was a time when a player would have been expelled from a club for drunkenness and rioting, but that day seems to have passed, unquote. Both Dockney and Pike left the athletics in late 1866. Until the 1869 season, the letter of the NABPP rules prohibited clubs from paying or compensating players in any form, but as applied, the prohibition was a little more elastic. Some forms of player compensation were accepted as honest and others weren't. The moralistic Henry Chadwick himself drew a distinction between hired men and, quote, those whose loss of time and necessary expenses are very properly paid. Quote, he wrote, all clubs who have first-class players in their 9s whose positions in life are not surrounded with pecuniary advantage or who are not, in fact, well off in the world, of course, take care that their players do not suffer from sacrificing their time to sustain the playing reputation of the club in which they are prominent players. But this style of thing is very different from hiring hired men and paying them so much a week for their services as professional cricketers are paid. One look at their careers, however, makes it obvious that Dockney and Pike belong to the latter category. Dockney played for the Gothams in 1864 and 1865, the Athletics in 1866, the Eurekas of Newark, New Jersey in 1867, two Cincinnati clubs, both the Cincinnati Buckeyes and the New York Mutuals in 68. Lippman Pike came up through Brooklyn junior clubs under the control of the Atlantics, where he was playing when he jumped to the Philadelphia Athletics for the 66 season, going on to play in New York, Baltimore, Hartford, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Providence. Dockney was a power-hitting catcher who'd been discovered on the sandlots of Hoboken by Harry Wright, then playing for the Gothams in the Elysian Fields. Dockney was exceptional among amateur-era ball players in several respects. He was born in Ireland, emigrating to the US as a 4-year-old. He was Catholic, and he had a working-class upbringing. He also drank heavily, caroused, and got into frequent legal trouble. In 1867, while a member of the Quaker City Club, Dockney was charged with stealing a pocket watch. He was acquitted, but he had a special affection for timepieces and was repeatedly arrested for that offense. In April of 1868, he was in Cincinnati playing for the Buckeyes when the newspapers reported that a certain Frank Robinson had been stabbed in the chest during a melee in a saloon at 256 Central Avenue. The truth emerged a few days later. Frank Robinson was the anachronistically hilarious false name that Patsy Dockney gave to the Cincinnati police. The saloon was a bordel. Embellished over the years and exaggerated beyond all recognition by sports writers, this sordid episode used to be a standard part of baseball lore. There are many versions, but here's one from 1919. A newspaper in 1919. Quote, in 1870, the Athletics went to St. Louis to play a series with the Star Club of that city. On the night before the first game, Dockney and some of his associates got involved in a fight in the St. Louis Cafe, and when it was all over, it was found that Dockney had been slashed with a butcher knife across the chest. The wound ran from one shoulder to the other. The blood streamed in torrents. Physicians took something like 50 stitches in his chest. The next day, he escaped from the hospital, reporting to the baseball grounds, ready for duty, caught the game that day without the use of a glove, mask, or chest protector, endured till the last man was out, and then collapsed. It's hard to know where to begin fact-checking this one. The actual incident took place in Cincinnati in 1868. A bordello is not a cafe. Dockney was not a member of the Athletics. Even though the story greatly exaggerates the size of Dockney's chest wound, in 1871, a prison intake record lists his principal scars and fails to mention a chest scar. Whatever really happened to him kept him out of baseball for 3 months. Dockney resigned from the Buckeyes in 1868, moving on to the Mutuals of New York and other clubs in 1869 and 70. In 1871, at 26, he was convicted of larceny and sentenced to 3.5 years in New York State Prison, where he was pardoned by the governor up to 3 years. He spent the next several years as a paid ringer for amateur clubs around New York City and worked as a fish butcher in New York's Washington Market. We don't know what happened to him after that or where he died. Prison records contain one other illuminating detail about Patsy Dockney. In 1871, the Sing Sing intake notes say that he had 2 crude blue dots on his left forearm and 3 more on his left hand. These are Victorian prison tats. Made by prisoners themselves, they signify sentences. Sure enough, Dockney's 1871 prison intake document states that he had served 5 previous jail terms. I started this talk talking about the social and cultural bubble that modern professional athletes live in. There was no such bubble in baseball's amateur era. The greatest difference between the sport then and now is that until the late 1860s, nearly all ball players supported themselves with non-baseball jobs, which meant that they participated fully in the world outside of sports, something I think we need to bear in mind if we really want to understand them. This is why it wasn't unusual for members of the Knickerbockers, Excelsiors, or Atlantics to practice law, medicine, run for office, do white-collar work, fight in wars. And it explains why some of them committed crimes and even felonies. Something that hasn't changed is our tendency to idealize sports heroes and to confuse athletic excellence with good moral character. Modern sports fans fall into this trap over and over again, no matter how many times we're shocked to discover that the ball players we admire beat their wives, take PEDs, or steal signs. Even the great Henry Chadwick wasn't immune, saying of Joe Leggett, the embezzler, liar, and cheat who abandoned his wife and young children, quote, "A fairer, more manly, or more gentlemanly player does not exist," unquote. That's the end.
Tom, thank you very much. If you would hit, there you go. You're doing fine. If you wish to go a different view of everything for the audience, just go up to the view, click again, and hit gallery, and you'll get everybody's.
Okay, is that good?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
We had one question, although I think it's tongue-in-cheek. Jason Horowitz asked, does Tom's relative have a pick in this year's Super Bowl?
You don't want to know. Record couldn't be worse.
I just want to make a comment about Pearsall. He was born in Florence, Alabama. And I lived in Florence, Alabama for a while. Afraid so. And although the bridge his father oversaw was long gone.
Yeah.
It was replaced by a double-deck railroad bridge in the 1890s. The big structure across the Tennessee River there is the TVA hydroelectric bridge just east of downtown Florence, which is named for Woodrow Wilson. It was built in 1918, so there must be some connection there. Are there any comment from Pamela Baker on such colorful people?
Yeah.
I don't think they set out to be colorful, but they certainly live colorful lives.
No, kind of. I was even kind of amazed by some of these stories. And Leggett, it's just hard to figure how it was a terribly popular person. I mean, it's hard to put a finger on what he was, what he really was, because the impulsive and sort of stupid, self-destructive nature of his crimes, and the disconnect between how people regarded him. And I don't think it's as simple as he was a sports hero and people gave him a lot of slack, like say a Denny McClain. I think it was, he's a remarkable person.
Well, certainly there's a lot of written about him and the development of the catcher's position in the
I think anything he's underrated, because we talk about who invented the curveball and who were the pioneers of early pitching, and it's easy to forget the catchers who are at least participants and possibly even the most important partner in the equation.
Well, just think about it. One of the projects of the committee is the Overlooked Legends, and the second Overlooked Legend was Deacon White, who started out as a catcher.
Yeah, and he's a great example because he's the guru of the curveball, and the pitcher couldn't throw what the catcher couldn't stop. And when you think about the independent variable in the careers of these three great pitchers, Cummings, Brainerd, and Creighton, it's Leggett.
And we'll hear more about Asa Brainerd next later, 2 weeks from now at the as Paul Weindorfer does the book club on the If I Never Get Back. There's a comment from Eric Mikulich that Sprague had Waddy Beach as a catcher.
I think the idea that the pitcher and catcher are close collaborators, it's still true in baseball, but it's probably a lot less true than it was in the past. And I think it was very, very true in the late amateur era.
Yeah. And if you want to read some more about that, about living, the first volume of Norm Mock's Connie Mack trilogy, that first volume has a lot about Mack as a player and how he developed as a catcher and how the game changed during the 1880s and 1890s. Well, thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate it. Tom has been with us before, and it's always an interesting talk. Peter, if you'd want to take us to the close.
Okay, Tom, that was a wonderful talk. Again, I retained some of it from the thread, listening again to it, and having just read the book that will be discussed next in a couple of weeks, actually, on with Paul Langendorfer, will be moderating a discussion of If We Never Get Back, and I was amazed at how it dovetailed when you started talking about Joyce and Champion and so forth of Cincinnati. Of course, the book is a novel and it has a whole nother story that's interwoven in it, but there is so much commonality, and that was very enjoyable. I just had one question I wanted to ask myself, and I think somebody just posted it just a second ago on chat. Were any of these individuals suspected of throwing games?
Yep.
That's a quick answer.
That's something that I think about a lot, and it's an interesting research area, because the problem with gambling is you've got baseball trying to sell itself, and one of the things it's trying to sell itself, one of the points it's trying to make is that it's clean. And it's sort of analogous to steroids in recent times, that you drive something into the shadows, but that means you don't really know what's going on in those shadows. There's a cost to that, good and bad. And I think, gambling played a mixed role in early baseball, but a really important role, and it's probably underrated by all of us. But, if I'll just mention one point, I mean, the risks of too much involvement with gambling in baseball are obvious. But, there's that Jack Chapman gave an interview just telling a story about something that happened on the 1868 Atlantics tour, where on a train trip through upstate New York, and he just happens to mention that who was in the train car at this incident. And it's bookies and boxers and sporting types from Brooklyn. And what are they doing on the Atlantics tour? I mean, if it had nothing to do with gambling, crime, or corruption, I don't know what they were doing there. And there were contemporary accusations of teams doing these Midwestern tours and then playing off a game, dropping a game, manipulating odds. And the more I read about the context, the more I think that wouldn't have been considered such a major crime in that context. I think it's something that we have a sort of harder line about as modern sports fans, because it was a different world then. And, a little gambling, a little manipulation for gambling purposes was a common thing in the middle 19th century in any sport. And one more thing I want to say about that is, if you ask the question why, organized baseball traces itself to the National Association of Baseball Players, and then what was the preceding precedent that established the National Association was the first convention in 1857. And why did that happen? And I think it had a lot to do with, in 1856, you probably all know this, there was an aborted attempt to have a convention. And it didn't happen at the instigation of the Gothams and some other people, because the Knickerbockers weren't interested.
Right.
Their attitude was, apparently, we're not interested in what other clubs are doing, so we don't want to discuss rules for inter-club play, et cetera, and making all the rules consistent, all the other things that would have been on the agenda. Well, then there was, in 56, there was a big game between the Knickerbockers and Gothams that attracted a lot of betting interest. And at the last minute, Pickney shows up who's playing for the Unions of Morrisania. He shows up in a Gotham uniform and helps them win the game. And there's a lot of complaining about it that shows up in the press. So the odds have been set, the bets have been made, and a ringer shows up. And I think that may have a lot to do with why the Knickerbockers are suddenly enthusiastic about a meeting to discuss rules the following year. So you could argue, if that scenario is true, that gambling instigated the organization of baseball itself.
When you think about
Peter, if I could throw out, there's a comment that I missed here. I missed two, but you got one of them. This is from Maury Bouchard, who says, this is a bit later, but Paul Hines was arrested for pickpocketing in the early 1920s when he was in his late 60s. A search of his premises yielded lots of wallets, purses, and eyeglasses. Earlier, though, he had helped prevent a murder, so maybe his slate is clean.
And, you know, it takes great eye-to-hand coordination to play baseball and pick pockets.
Yeah, when I
The
think
skill,
of
the skill is always there.
when I think of Leggett, raiding those charities, it was it would take a lot less to justify his, troubling a game,
Yeah,
that would be a simple thing, like comparison. Well, Tom, we really do appreciate it. It was an excellent presentation, and much of it came back to me from the thread, but there was some additional items you put in there that I thought were really, really insightful. And again, I just want to go to Joanne Hobart for a minute. If you would, she said she had before we started. She said she had an announcement, and okay,
Yes,
Joanne. So
okay. All right. The announcement is it comes from Jacob Pomrenke. All right. And he has put out the numbers for the numbers of downloads on all of the publications put out by SABR last year. And there were 6 of them. And number 1 on the list for last year was Turnstile Volume 3. So it's still available. And the other thing that he had put in there also was about the updated list of all-time leaders in the ebook download since we launched the SABR Digital Library in 2011. Turnstile and Yankee Stadium are already on the top 10 all time. If I can run through all of them, but Turnstile comes in as number 5 on the all time. On last year's list, Turnstile was number 1 for 2023. Yankee Stadium was number 2, which kind of like, that's kind of like hits homes anyway. But in the all time, for SABR, Yankee Stadium comes in as number 10. So they just made it onto the all-time list. Turnstile at 5. And number 1 for all time is the 1919 White Sox with a total of 2,941.
well,
So
congratulations, Joe. If that's
yeah.
the
Yeah.
Turnstile. It goes to show you that this is a literary group.
Yes, absolutely. And Turnstile number 4, we're just checking with the person who's doing the layout to see how it's coming along. We think it's very close. It will be this year. We'll see how Turnstile 4 does for 2024.
Okay, well, good luck.
Oh, and also one last thing in regard to what Bill Humber was saying about that proverb. When an old man or old woman dies, a library burns. And that comes from a classic, ancient, old African proverb. So it does have a long history. I think I did remember reading it in the book about the librarians of Timbuktu. So I thought it was a very apt proverb, though, in regard to talking about Larry McRae, who we do miss terribly. So
Very
that's
nice.
what I got for you.
Well, thank you, Joe. That was a good one. Thank you.
All right.
So in our next presentation will be by Matt Albertson, and it'll be about the 1895 Phillies and a fan's view of the 1895 Phillies based on a survey done of the 1895 fans. So it's a very interesting. He did that presentation like Tom. He did that presentation at the Fred. It was one of the double track presentations, so many people didn't see it. And of course, anybody that didn't come to the Fred didn't see it. But it is I happened to just see it, and I said to Matt, I hope you can do that again in our 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series. And that'll be coming up on February the 13th. So February the 13th, a Tuesday night, 8 p.m. will be our next 19th Century Speaker Series with Matt Albertson. If you can't wait until February 13th, the end of this month on January 30th, please join Paul and with the Langendorfer with the If I Never Get Back book club discussion. And that'll be our first one for the winter. And it'll be followed by another one with Jack Bales and a third one again with Matt Albertson. So we'll see you soon, and thank you very much for tuning in tonight. Thank you. Thanks again, Tom.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody.
Good night, all.
Night.
Bye now.
Right.